In episode 89, titled On-Path Attacks, What Gets Exposed and How to Reduce It, we focus on a class of threats where the attacker sits between endpoints and either intercepts or manipulates traffic as it moves across a network. On-path attacks are sometimes described as man-in-the-middle attacks, but the exam tends to care less about the label and more about what becomes exposed when traffic is not protected. The reason these attacks matter is that they exploit the fact that networks are shared, routed, and often outside your control, especially when users are remote and operating on public infrastructure. When you understand what the attacker can do from an on-path position, the defensive strategy becomes straightforward. Protect data in transit, verify who you are talking to, and reduce reliance on fragile trust assumptions. Before we continue, a quick note: this audio course is a companion to the CloudNetX books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. An attacker who is on path can potentially read, modify, or redirect communications when the traffic is not properly protected, and those three verbs are a useful way to frame the risk. Reading is the confidentiality problem, where sensitive data such as credentials, tokens, or personal information can be captured and reused. Modifying is the integrity problem, where the attacker changes what is sent or received, possibly inserting malicious content, altering transactions, or weakening security settings in flight. Redirecting is the authenticity and routing problem, where the attacker steers a user toward a fake destination or a malicious service while making it appear normal. These capabilities can also combine, where the attacker first redirects to a look-alike endpoint and then reads credentials while modifying responses to hide the deception. The exam often expects you to connect these effects to specific controls that prevent them, rather than treating on-path attacks as mysterious wizardry. Common vectors make on-path attacks feel less theoretical because they appear in real user behavior and real infrastructure failures. Rogue Wi-Fi is a classic vector, where an attacker sets up a wireless network that looks legitimate and then positions themselves to observe or manipulate traffic from connected devices. Compromised routers or intermediate network devices are another vector, because if routing infrastructure is controlled by an attacker or infected with malicious firmware, traffic can be intercepted or modified at scale. Spoofing shows up in multiple forms, including address resolution protocol spoofing on local networks and domain name system spoofing that pushes users toward attacker-controlled destinations. These vectors share a theme. The attacker does not need to break cryptography if they can exploit weak trust at the network layer and then take advantage of unprotected or poorly validated sessions. Recognizing the vector helps you anticipate what signals might appear and which defenses are most effective. The most reliable control against on-path attacks is encryption in transit, because encryption protects confidentiality and integrity even when the network path is hostile. When you encrypt traffic, an on-path attacker may still see that communication is happening and may still be able to influence routing, but they cannot easily read the content or alter it without detection. This is why transport layer security, often shortened to TLS after first mention, is foundational for web traffic, application programming interfaces, and many service-to-service communications. Encryption also helps with credential protection because it prevents passive capture of usernames, passwords, and tokens that could be replayed later. The exam framing usually emphasizes that encryption is not only about secrecy, but also about integrity, because modern protocols detect tampering and reject altered data. If you remember that encryption provides both confidentiality and integrity in transit, you are already aligned with the defensive core of this topic. Certificate validation is what turns encryption into authenticated encryption, because without validation, you can encrypt traffic to the wrong endpoint and still lose. Certificates bind a public key to an identity, and the trust chain is what lets a client decide that the binding is legitimate rather than attacker-invented. Trust chains prevent impersonation by relying on certificate authorities and validation rules that confirm the certificate is issued for the correct name, is not expired, and is not revoked in a way that matters to the client. When validation is skipped or warnings are ignored, an attacker can present a fake certificate and still establish an encrypted session, which is a common technique in active interception. This is why certificate warnings are not cosmetic, and why organizations care about proper certificate management. Because identity verification is how you know who is on the other end. The exam tends to reward the idea that encryption without trust validation is incomplete defense because it protects content but not authenticity. A scenario makes the risk easy to visualize, so consider a user who connects to open Wi-Fi in a public place and then logs into a service that looks normal. The network is open. The access point may be legitimate or malicious, and the user device may automatically join because it has joined similar networks before. If the login flow is not properly protected, or if the user is tricked into accepting a certificate warning, the attacker can capture credentials or session tokens and reuse them later. Even if the user thinks they are being cautious, the attacker can manipulate domain name system responses or inject redirects to steer the browser toward an imposter site that resembles the real one. In this scenario, the attacker does not need to exploit a vulnerability in the application because the weakness is in the path and in the trust decisions made by the client. The lesson is that untrusted networks should be treated as hostile by default, and the controls should assume the path can be observed and influenced. One pitfall is ignoring certificate warnings and training users poorly, because user behavior is often the final gate that prevents an on-path attacker from completing impersonation. If users are conditioned to click through warnings to get work done, they will eventually click through the warning that matters, especially when they are rushed. Training that focuses on fear without explaining why the warning exists can backfire because users treat warnings as noise rather than as a meaningful signal about identity verification failure. Effective education emphasizes that certificate warnings often indicate you are not talking to the intended service, which is exactly what an on-path attacker wants. Organizations also reduce this burden by preventing unsafe overrides through policy where appropriate, because relying solely on user judgment under stress is a weak control. The exam generally expects you to recognize that user training must be paired with technical enforcement to be reliable. Another pitfall is legacy protocols that send credentials in cleartext because on-path attackers thrive when the payload is readable. Some older protocols and misconfigured services still transmit authentication data without encryption, or they use weak protection that can be downgraded or bypassed. Even when the application is modern, a legacy management interface, an older email protocol configuration, or an internal service assumed to be safe can leak credentials when used over an untrusted segment. Cleartext credentials are especially dangerous because they are reusable, and once captured, they can enable access far beyond the original session. The exam angle is that you must identify and eliminate cleartext authentication paths because they turn any untrusted network into a credential harvesting opportunity. When you enforce modern encrypted protocols, you remove the easiest wins for on-path attackers. Quick wins tend to focus on policy and defaults that remove weak options, starting with enforcing transport layer security and requiring strong, validated encryption for all sensitive traffic. Enforcing transport layer security means not allowing fallback to insecure versions and not exposing services that permit cleartext logins when secure alternatives exist. Using a virtual private network, spelled out as virtual private network, on untrusted networks adds a protective tunnel that reduces exposure to local interception and makes it harder for an attacker on the local network to see or influence internal traffic. These measures work best when they are automatic, such as always-on virtual private network for corporate devices or application policies that refuse insecure connections. The idea is to make the secure path the default path, so that users do not have to make complex decisions when they are away from trusted infrastructure. When these quick wins are implemented, the attack surface for on-path interception drops sharply. Monitoring also plays a role, because even with strong encryption, attackers may attempt redirection, spoofing, and traffic manipulation that can be visible through metadata and behavioral signals. Unusual domain name system changes are a key cue, such as sudden shifts in resolved addresses for critical domains, unexpected new name servers, or anomalous time-to-live behavior that suggests tampering. Redirect patterns are another cue, such as repeated redirects through unfamiliar domains, mismatched certificate names, or sudden changes in endpoint geography that do not match user location. Monitoring for these cues is especially important in hybrid environments, where domain name system and routing may span on-premises and cloud components, creating more places for misconfiguration or compromise. The exam framing often expects you to know that on-path attacks can be detected indirectly, not by reading encrypted content, but by observing suspicious changes in resolution and connection behavior. When monitoring is aligned to these cues, defenders can catch attacks that attempt to steer users toward malicious endpoints even when encryption is present. A simple memory anchor is encrypt, validate, segment, monitor, educate, because it lays out the defenses in the order that builds a strong posture. Encrypt protects content and integrity in transit. Validate ensures you are talking to the right endpoint through proper certificate checks and trust chains. And segment reduces exposure by limiting where sensitive traffic can traverse and which networks are considered safe. Monitor watches for redirection and resolution anomalies that suggest path manipulation, and educate reinforces the behaviors that prevent users from bypassing protections when warnings appear. This anchor is useful because on-path defenses are rarely a single control, and missing any one layer can reopen the path for an attacker. When you can explain how each part contributes, you demonstrate exam-ready understanding and practical defensive thinking. The anchor also keeps your response focused on actionable steps rather than on attack lore. If you are choosing a mitigation set for public network users, the goal is to assume the network is hostile and then ensure the user's traffic remains protected and authenticated end-to-end. That set usually includes enforced transport layer security for all sensitive services, virtual private network usage for access to internal resources, and policy that prevents accepting invalid certificates or using insecure protocols. It also benefits from secure domain name system practices where feasible, such as using trusted resolvers and monitoring for unusual resolution behavior, because many on-path attacks begin with steering rather than with breaking encryption. Device hardening and updated clients matter too, because modern protocol implementations reduce downgrade risk and improve validation behavior. The exam expects you to tie mitigations to the attack's capabilities, so you are matching controls to the risk of interception, modification, and redirection. When you frame it that way, your mitigation selection becomes a reasoned response rather than a generic checklist. As a mini-review, it helps to restate the attack effects and defenses once in a compact way that reinforces the model. On-path attacks expose unprotected traffic by enabling interception, manipulation, and redirection, and they are reduced by strong encryption, strict certificate validation, careful segmentation, monitoring for suspicious resolution and redirect behavior, and user education that treats warnings as meaningful. That summary is intentionally simple because the exam often tests whether you can connect the threat to the correct defensive categories without getting lost in details. If you can hold this summary in mind, you can answer many questions about public Wi-Fi, spoofing, and interception by mapping back to the same core logic. This is also how teams build consistent guidance, because the same principles apply across many specific network situations. Consistency is what makes defenses repeatable and teachable. Episode 89 concludes with a practical reduction mindset. Assume the path can be hostile, then make sure communications are encrypted, authenticated, and observable through the right signals. On-path attacks succeed most easily when users connect through untrusted infrastructure, accept warnings, or rely on legacy cleartext protocols, so the fastest wins come from enforcing transport layer security, using virtual private network tunnels on public networks, and preventing unsafe overrides. Monitoring for domain name system anomalies and unexpected redirects adds an additional layer that can surface manipulation attempts even when content is encrypted. The rehearsal assignment is a secure path narration where you take a common user flow, such as logging in from a public network, and narrate how encryption, validation, and policy keep the user talking to the intended service without exposing credentials. When you can narrate that path clearly, you are demonstrating both exam-level reasoning and the operational instinct to engineer security into the assumptions of everyday network use. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.